think it's time to start tonight. Jimmy called me today about mid-morning and said that I think he wasn't feeling well, wasn't going to be here tonight, and asked if I would take the class. I said that I would. So tonight we will not be in, I think he's been teaching on Tell No One. I think it's been his topic. So I asked him if he wanted me to do something on that, and he said, no, do something else. So I debated having a class focused on the hyperboles of Jesus in the New Testament. I decided not to do that. I would like to do it sometime, even though I've had a class out here before on figures of speech in the New Testament, but it's a fascinating study to me. So as it is, I've decided that what I'll do, Jimmy also called home yesterday and told Caroline I was out or something, and told Caroline that we would have a guest speaker this Sunday, and that he would be conducting a class in the auditorium as well as the regular worship service, and therefore I would not be teaching Sunday. And last Sunday I started a class on a series of 6 lessons, or 6 weeks I think, on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So I decided, rather than branching out into something new tonight, I would just try to pick up our study in Thessalonians, because we're going to miss one of the 6 weeks it appears anyway, and I suppose there's probably a fair chance that we might even miss more than one. So anyway, that's what we'll do tonight. If you would bow with me, and we'll start the class with a prayer. Yes?
I'm not sure if they announced it here, but the Maddox kids were involved in an ATV accident, and they were at the ER, but everybody seems to be okay. But we do want to remember Andrew and Megan Maddox's kids in prayer.
The two boys, I guess.
And the little girl.
And the little girl. Okay. We'll certainly do that. I'll also mention, I'm sure most of you are aware that Dennis Richardson passed away from a massive heart attack Monday. Dennis and Lisa were a part of this congregation for many years before they moved to Camden, and they've been very active in the church over there. And I think that's a real loss, and our hearts go out to that family in that situation. So if you would bow with me, and we'll start the class with a prayer. Father in heaven, we're grateful for the day. We're grateful, Father, for your love and for your mercy and your grace. We're grateful for this opportunity that we have to come tonight and to study from your word. I pray, Father, that it'll be beneficial to us, that we will learn something, and also that we will be reinforced and edified in our walk with you. We've just learned, Father, I have just learned that the 3 Maddox children of Megan and Andrew were in a ATV accident this afternoon. I think the report is that they're doing okay, but Father, I know that at the same time that's been a very trying time for not only for the children, but certainly for the parents and all of their families, and even the extended family here at church, and for those that knew about it. And I pray, Father, for them. I pray, Father, that the diagnosis that apparently is out now, that they're okay, holds up to be true in that regard, that nothing later develops. I pray, Father, also that you would bless that family as they go through this ordeal together. And we know that it's an event that is very shaking to any family, but certainly when you have 3 children that are involved in an accident, it can be a very trying time. I also pray, Father, for the family of Dennis Richardson. I pray, Father, that you would bless that family with the peace and with the comfort, the kind of peace that only you can give, and the kind that surpasses understanding. Tonight we're going to speak some about death and those that have no hope when this life is over, but we know that that is not the truth with that family, and we're thankful for that. I pray, Father, that you would bless us in this study tonight, watch over us and keep us in your love, for it's in the name of Jesus I pray. Amen. Some of what I'm going to start with tonight will be a repeat or a rehearsal of some of the things I said Sunday. If you were in here Sunday, that's well and good. I think the way we learn things, the way I learn things is by repetition, and I think that's well and good. If you were not in here Sunday, then I hope that you will find some of the things that we say or that I say will be informative to you, and that you'll have a better understanding of what I intend for us to try to look at tonight. Paul established a Thessalonian church on his second missionary journey. And I mentioned last week, when you think about the missionary journeys that Paul went on, he went on 3, and then he went on also a trip to Rome that's really not considered a missionary journey, although he certainly was involved in evangelizing that part of the world when he spent the time that he did at Rome. That time was in prison and under house arrest, and it's part of the time. But in establishing the Thessalonian church, we can read about it in Acts chapter 17. Actually, there's only about 9 verses that cover the time that Paul spent with the Thessalonians in Acts chapter 17. However, as I pointed out last week, I think we need to think at times, and perhaps you do, but I find myself, at least in times past, not as aware of these things as I perhaps try to be now. When Paul was at Thessalonica and established the church there on his second journey, the Bible tells us that he went into the synagogues in reason with the Jews for 3 Sabbaths. And if you read the narrative of those 7 verses, it seems like that after the 3rd Sabbath that the unbelieving Jews were stirred up against him and ran him out of town. And actually that is what happened, but I think many Bible scholars are somewhat of the opinion that Paul spent more than 3 weeks in Thessalonica. Now, they all agree that he probably was there a short period of time. But if you just read the narrative from those 7 verses, it seems like that, he was there 1 Sabbath. Now, whether or not he got there the day before the Sabbath or 6 days before the Sabbath, we don't know. And whether or not he left the day after the 3rd Sabbath or 6 days after the 3rd Sabbath or even 3 weeks or several weeks after the 3rd Sabbath, we don't know that. But we do know from the things that he wrote in the Thessalonian letter back to these people, we do know that these people, these Thessalonians, were very well instructed in much of the Christian faith. And it's difficult to comprehend that Paul was able to accomplish that in 3 short weeks of time. And you might say, well, what if he only had, 6 weeks or a couple of months? Well, you can do a lot more in 6 weeks or a couple of months than you can in 3 weeks. And I mentioned last week that the Stanford University has I guess you'd call it an app, but it's a tool on their website. It's under the name, I believe, of Orbis, O-R-B-I-S, I believe. And it's a geospatial tool where anyone is able to go in there and log into that tool and put in places in the Roman world. And this tool was a geospatial of the Roman world. I think I left that out at that time. And because many of the cities that existed in the Roman times are in the time of Paul, 2,000 years ago, roughly. Many of the cities that existed then are not in existence today. So obviously you can't find them on a map today, but this tool is able to locate those places. I'm sure that through other means that historical references is able to identify many of those places, even the ruins. I pointed out last week that Thessalonica itself is still a city today. In Paul's time, it had a population of about 200,000 people, which just blows my mind, a city of that size in that day and time, and how a city of that size would function, I guess we would say, or I would say, as it relates to my being blown away by a city of 200,000 people. But today, Thessalonica is not called Thessalonica, it's called Thessaloniki. I have to always stop and think how it's sailed. But the last four letters of the alphabet is N-I-K-I. We would call it Nike, but it's pronounced Nike. And today it has a population of over 800,000. So it is a big city today. But this tool that the Stanford University developed, it allows one to go and put in a place of reference in the Roman world at that time, and be able to determine distances from that place to other places. And as a result of that, some people have already downloaded on the internet the distances that Paul traveled in his missionary journeys. And I think I mentioned last Sunday, that he traveled, I think, 1,573 miles on his first missionary journey. He traveled 3,050 miles on his second missionary journey. The tool not only will give you the distance traveled, but it will give you the time it would take to travel those distances, assuming that you travel by what is believed to be the method that Paul used between the points of interest that he went to. In other words, much of Paul's travel, much of it was by foot. So when he traveled 1,500 on his first missionary journey, much of that travel was by foot. They did travel by sea, and this tool will travel by sea is much faster than walking on foot. And a day's journey was considered, we said, about 20 to 25 miles. So if a man walked about 20 miles a day, and if he was traveling 1,000 miles, for instance, it would take him, 50 days to get there, approaching 2 months. That's just time spent walking. It's not including the time that a little stop in the shade, he might stop to get some water, he might stop to converse with people or whatever. So I'm just telling you that to give you some idea of the time that was involved and the distances that was involved in Paul's travels. The tool also, and I didn't go into this Sunday, and I'm not going to get into it tonight in detail, but the tool also will give you the estimated cost. It blows me, which was a Roman coin, and in the Gospel, I think it's in the book of Matthew, it's identified as a penny. Now, when you do a little research on it, a denarii was considered to be a day's wages. So we might say, well, a man worked for a penny all day for a penny. Well, the penny in that day and time would certainly have a greater value today or something. So that gets a little bit complicated, but they also have the cost of his travels. Now, you would think if he's walking, well, there's no cost, but there certainly is. He had to have food, even though he did get assistance. At least on 2 occasions, he commended the folks for sending to him or for furnishing his needs, that is, economic needs, sharing with him in the fellowship. But no doubt he had to stay in places on his travels, and that cost money too. And then when he sailed by ship, that wasn't free. So if you look at this, it's rather astounding. It's more money than I would have thought, but that's about all I'm going to say of that at this time. But this book of Thessalonians that Paul wrote, when he established church in 1 Corinthians chapter 17, and he was running town after he left Athens, 1 Thessalonians, I beg your pardon. He left Philippi to go to Thessalonica. And we remember the things happened at Philippi. That's where Lydia was converted. That's where Paul cast the demon out of this slave girl that was able to, I guess the soothsayers, whatever, used her. She brought much gain to them, monetary gain. And when Paul cast the demon out of her, they rose up against Paul and ran him out of Philippi. That's when he goes to Thessalonica. There's one thing that I left on Sunday that I am going to mention just now briefly, and after class was over Sunday, I felt like I didn't do a good job conveying that. Paul and Silas began the second missionary journey by themselves. As they went up through Syria and Cilicia, they went through Lystra, which was a city or a town where Paul and Barnabas had established a church on this first journey. And at Lystra, apparently he had converted a young man there by the name of Timothy. And on his second journey, Timothy joined Paul and Silas to continue on their secondary journey, on their second missionary journey. They wanted to go up into Asia Minor and into Mysia. The Spirit forbade them on both occasions, so they went down to Troas. Now, we're very familiar, I think, with Troas because of Acts chapter 20 and what we learn about Troas there. But keep in mind, at the time that Paul was at Troas on this journey is not the same time that we read about Troas in Acts chapter 20. But at Troas, what's interesting is apparently Paul and Silas and Timothy was joined by Luke. And we know that, we have reason to believe that, because Luke wrote the book of Acts. He also wrote in the writing of Paul's journeys in the book of Acts, he used the third person plural. They did this. They went there. They lodged, taught here, did that. But at Troas, Luke changed his narrative to we. And at Troas is where Paul received a vision in the night. It is called the Macedonian call to go over. This man appeared in a vision to Paul and says, come over to Macedonia and help us. Now keep in mind, on this journey, they wanted to go up into Asia and into Mysia, and the Spirit wouldn't let them, so they end up going down to Troas. And while they're there, he receives this Macedonian call. And at that point, they launched, it reads like the next day. I'm not certain that the verbiage is that way, but they left immediately or very soon from Troas to go into Macedonia. And they landed at, I think, at Amphipolis or Apollonia. They went on down. And the first city in Macedonia that we're told where he taught was in Philippi. Now, keep in mind, I said last week, and I think this helps us too to remember, Paul, no doubt, taught people along the way. So when they were at Amphipolis and Apollonia, I am of the opinion that Paul certainly taught the gospel there. We do not know whether or not he established a church. I said last week that he established 14 churches, and he wrote 13 of the epistles in the New Testament, or letters and books in the New Testament. We know for certain. Some people think he wrote the book of Hebrews. If so, he would have written 14 books. But I mentioned that because I want you to understand. It seems like, well, if he established 14 churches and he wrote 13 letters, then maybe one church didn't get a letter before we kind of think through that. But actually, that's not the case at all. There was a number of churches, many more churches that Paul established that did not get a letter from him than there was who did. For instance, we know that he wrote 2 letters to the Corinthians we have record of. Many scholars believe he makes reference to a 3rd letter to the Corinthians, so it's apparent that he really wrote 3 letters to the Corinthians. One was never preserved. But many scholars believe that Paul even wrote a 4th letter to the Thessalonians. But now, 3 and 4 is not counted in the 13 that I'm saying that we know he wrote 13 churches. He also wrote 2 letters to the Thessalonians, and he wrote 2 letters to Timothy, although Timothy is not a church, he's an individual. So just out of those 13, we can eliminate 2 of the churches he wrote 4 letters to, we know for certain that we have a record of. So I just wanted to clarify that when we think about how many letters he wrote, or books in the New Testament, shall I say, and then how many churches he established. I'm of the opinion that he established many more than 14 churches. That's just what we know of. And I'm of that opinion, and I said Sunday, because John in his letter and writing and speaking of Jesus said many of the signs did Jesus in the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in these books. But if they were recorded, I suppose the world could not even hold the quantity of books that would have been written. Now, you talk about a hyperbole. Certainly that would be a hyperbole. Hyperbole being a gross exaggeration. That would be a gross exaggeration. But we understand what John was saying when he said that. What he was saying was, Jesus did many, many things that are not written, but these things are written in this book that you might believe. By the same token, I think that when Paul was on his journeys, that he wrote, that he spoke and taught many people and even established churches that we have no record of. The Spirit just didn't see fit to tell us that. So after they leave Philippi, they end up in Thessalonica, and they run out of town in short order. Then they go to Berea, and we all remember about Berea. What is that statement? The Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians, in that they searched the Scriptures daily to see whether or not those things were so. I don't know about you, but when I read that verse, it almost makes me think, well, the Thessalonians, they weren't too good of a Christians. But now those Bereans were. It might surprise you to know that the word noble just simply meant that they were better bred, if I might say it that way. So the Bereans were basically, I don't know how we might liken it to our day and time. We might say, well, when we think of, say, Nashville, Tennessee, and say Brentwood is a more prosperous, affluent area of the town than the overall population of Nashville would be. And I suppose that in some sense that word noble, as it relates to the Bereans, is speaking of that they were better bred. They were maybe a little higher class of people, even though it's not worded exactly that way. However, we do know, and that's not taken from anything from the text, we do know that it specifies that they searched the Scriptures daily to see whether or not those things are so. The reason some commentators think that they were better bred, perhaps more affluent, is because not everyone had Scriptures. You know, the Scripture that is being spoken of at that time was not the New Testament. It was the Old Testament. And the Old Testament books were written in scrolls. And they weren't as plentiful as books are today. You can go down to Books A Million or whatever, and you know, there's just no end to the number of books that have been printed and remain in print, as well as it seems to me there's no end of even today of people that writes a book. Nearly everybody in the world now, well, it seems like nearly everybody, if you're anything at all, you write a book, you know, at least as it relates to people that we are accustomed to on TV or whatever. But not everyone had access to the Scriptures, perhaps, and it seems that some scholars think, but the Bereans being more noble may indicate that they had more access to Scriptures, but certainly it does commend them for searching the Scriptures daily to see whether or not the things Paul said was so. Now, what things were they looking at? They was looking at the fact that Paul was trying to convince, everywhere he went, he was preaching Jesus. And he was trying to convince the Jews, and many of them wouldn't listen to him, and then he'd turn to the Gentiles, but he was trying to convince them that this Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah that is prophesied throughout the Old Testament. And that's the reason Paul got in trouble. The Judaizing teachers that followed him about on his journeys, and you know, they even tried to kill him. Ultimately, he sought permission to go to Rome to appeal to Caesar. That kind of put an end to that, but it also accomplished other things that I think the Lord had in mind for him to get him to Rome anyway. So when they leave Berea, they'll go to Athens. Now, keep in mind, we said that Paul received the Macedonian call. The Macedonian call, the Macedonia itself, is the northern province or state, shall we say, Roman province or state, shall we say, of the country of Greece. And the southern state or the southern province of the country of Greece was Achaia. Philippi and Thessalonica were in Macedonia as well as Berea. But when you get to Athens and to Corinth, you're then in Achaia. They're all cities in the country of Greece. So the Greek culture was very prominent in all of these places that Paul was visiting on this second missionary journey after they had left Troas for certain, even though as far as that goes, the Greek culture had become very prominent even in the Bible lands itself. So when they get to Corinth, Paul keep in mind, he was run out of Thessalonica quickly, whether or not it was 3 weeks or shortly thereafter, or maybe 2 or 3 months. He was still run out quickly before his work was completed there. And Paul was in agony. He wondered or worried about how the Thessalonian Christians were making it. And so he sent Timothy back. Actually, he sent Timothy back when he was at Athens. He says that we thought it good to be left alone. So he sent Timothy back to Thessalonica. And the purpose of Timothy's visit back to Thessalonica was to go back and to find out how the church is doing. Have they remained faithful? Have they just disbanded? Have they fell apart? And they didn't have the internet or 24-hour news at that time. All the news traveled just about by foot or by, camelback or horseback or whatever. But you weren't able to get information quickly. So Paul was in agony about how these Thessalonians had continued to carry on after they had left. That is what prompted him to write 1 Thessalonians, meaning that when Timothy came back from Thessalonica to Corinth and joined Paul again, he brought Paul a report of the Thessalonians. And at that point, Paul sat down and wrote 1 Thessalonians rather quickly, rather soon after Timothy came back. If you're into dates, in which I like to look at dates, but if you're into dates, most Bible scholars tend to think that 1 Thessalonians was written in AD 51 or 52. Some will put it as late as 54. Personally, I think AD 51 is a little fast, so I tend to think it's probably AD 52 to 53 or in that range. But whether or not it's one or the other makes really no difference. The reason Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians and even 2 Thessalonians 2, he wrote 2 Thessalonians to kind of correct some misunderstandings that apparently the Thessalonians had received had reached whenever they got his first letter. There appears to yet been some confusion going on, and so Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians not long after he wrote 1 Thessalonians to kind of clarify what he had said in his first book to help them understand that a little bit better. As far as the subject of 1 and 2 Thessalonians, the book was written primarily for 3 purposes. One was to encourage the Thessalonians because they too were enduring persecution. Remember, Paul left town because of persecution. They ran him out of town. If he hadn't left town, they no doubt would have probably stoned him or killed him. So the Christians there in Thessalonica were also enduring persecution. And in his letter to them, he commends them that, you're enduring persecution as we did. I think that's in the 3rd chapter. The second reason that Paul wrote, the second theme, shall I say, in Thessalonians, is that was to encourage them in holy living. Now, most of you who have been in my classes before know that I am very much of the persuasion that we're justified by faith. That troubles some people because when you hear that, you tend to think that nothing else is important and nothing is farther from the truth. Paul, in this book to Thessalonians here, the second thing that he did was he wanted to encourage these Christians in Thessalonica to continue to live godly lives. And there's much to be said about that for you and I. We should also continue to live godly lives even though we understand that our salvation is not by our works. And in the third theme of Thessalonians, both first and second, which I think is the biggest theme by far, is the second coming of Christ. Now, in this day and time, actually it might surprise you. I think that the book of Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, has more detail as it relates to the second coming of Christ that you'll find in the New Testament anywhere. Jesus spoke sometimes of his second coming, but it was kind of muted a little bit. It was not as clear to understand. And when I say that, I'm thinking primarily of Matthew chapter 24, which has been grossly misunderstood by many people. That's not to say that I understand it good myself, because I don't. If I've not told you before, I will tell you today. I know I've said it many times, though. The older I get, sometimes the more I feel like the less I know. And the more I study, sometimes I feel like the less I know. And so I think that, but in the 24th chapter of Matthew, Jesus speaks about not only his second coming, but he also speaks primarily in that chapter, I think, about the destruction of Jerusalem. And those things are a little bit hard to separate, which is which, and it causes much confusion. But when you think about the second coming of Christ, this is I said last week, and I'll repeat tonight, 1 Thessalonians is believed to be the first New Testament book that Paul wrote. Now, that's not to say it's the first New Testament book. Most scholars think that the book of James is the first New Testament book. However, there are a few scholars that think that James was written in the late 50s or early 60s. Actually, he was stoned to death, I think, in AD 62. But there's a few scholars that think that. But the consensus opinion is that James was probably written in the late AD 48 or 49, prior to the council at Jerusalem. And I said last week, the reason the scholars believe that is because James was, I guess we might say, the main elder at Jerusalem. You remember when they went up to Jerusalem to settle the question about the circumcision? Paul and Barnabas and others went with him down there to meet with the elders and the leaders at the church at Jerusalem. James is the main leader there, and James is the one who says, brethren, we should put no other burden on them but that they abstain from idols, that they abstain from things strangled, from blood, and from fornication. That was the four things that they put in a letter to send back to the church. This was a church up in Antioch. To send back to the church at Antioch to tell the Gentile converts up there, or the Gentile Christians, you don't have to keep the law of Moses and be be circumcised, but you do need to do these four things. And as I said last week, I think that when we read that many times, it's kind of confusing to us, because the church there in Jerusalem didn't say anything about the Antioch, the Gentile converts abstaining from stealing or abstaining from murder. These things are also a part of, say, the 10 Commandments that the Jews believed. They didn't say anything about that. The reason I am persuaded that they gave the order to abstain from the four things that they did, because these Gentiles had come out of pagan religions. And in pagan religions, the eating meats offered to idols was a common practice. We are told that fornication was a common practice in worship of the pagans. Now that blows my mind how that would be a practice in any kind of worship other than devil worship. And then the eating things strangled or blood also was a part of pagan worship. So when they laid this edict on them to abstain from those four things, I am persuaded that it's because those were the things that they had come out of. And they're telling them, you'll do well if you abstain from these four things. Don't worry about keeping the law of Moses, as there had some gone up from Jerusalem and had been telling those Christians up there, except you do keep the law and are circumcised, you're not going to go to heaven. You're not going to be saved. So that's how it was settled. The point I'm saying is that James was a leader in the church in Jerusalem, and they had issued this edict. Most all scholars say in AD 50. It's surprisingly in the latter times. There are a few scholars that say that happened in late AD 49. But I'm going to stick with AD 50. I don't know that it matters anyway. But what scholars who believe that James wrote the first book in the New Testament base it on primarily, they think it was written in the late 40s, but they think that if it had been written after AD 50, that James certainly would have made reference to the council at Jerusalem and what was decided. And that certainly seems plausible. So now then, back to Thessalonians then. In the book of Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians are 5 chapters, and in 2 Thessalonians there are 3 chapters. That's a total of 8 chapters together. All 8 chapters, every book, I beg your pardon, every chapter of the books of Thessalonians that Paul wrote makes reference to the second coming of Christ. You can't say that about any other book in the New Testament. You can't say that the New Testament, that every book, every chapter in that book makes reference to the second coming of Christ, but it does in Paul, in Thessalonians. And for that reason, that's the reason I said earlier, that's the reason that I think the major theme of Thessalonians is the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm going to start tonight. We don't have much time left. But I'm going to read chapter 4, beginning in verse about 13, and go through the end of the chapter, which is only about 5 verses. Paul wrote to these Thessalonians. Now, keep in mind, he has sent Timothy. He didn't know how these Thessalonian Christians were doing. He sent Timothy back to check on them, to get a meter or a reading on, are they remaining faithful? What's going on over there? Timothy comes back and tells him they're doing pretty well. Because Paul was excited when he got the news from Timothy as it related to the Thessalonians. And he writes to them in the early part of this first book of Thessalonians, he writes to them and he commends them in various ways of saying it, that your faith is known throughout the whole world. He didn't say, I'm proud of you, but if you read those verses, you can certainly conclude Paul was proud of where they were. But he also understood that they were misunderstanding some things, and Timothy had relayed that information to him, and one of the things that troubled them was the second coming of Christ. Apparently, Paul had talked in his writing in his book itself, he told them in there, did we not talk about these things when we were among you? Didn't we discuss these things? But apparently after they had left, there had been some people, whether or not they came from outside or whether or not it rose from within themselves because of their incorrect understanding. But some people were of the opinion there is no resurrection. That really shouldn't surprise us. If you think about before Paul got down to Corinth, he went to Athens, and when he was at Athens, he preached on Mars Hill, if you remember. You've heard many sermons about Acts chapter 17. It's a continuation of what we find in the Thessalonians, the time he spent at Thessalonians. But in Acts chapter 17, at verse, towards the end of that chapter, Paul made reference to the resurrection. And if you remember, when he said that, the people that was listening to him, some of them said, we're not going to listen to this guy anymore, and they left. And others said, we'll hear more about this later. But the point being is that they didn't want to hear of a resurrection of the dead. Now, it might surprise you, in Greek mythology or in Greek culture, we tend to think that we're Christians, and we certainly are, but we tend to think that as Christians, we're the only people that believe in the resurrection. Or, I beg your pardon, we're the only people that believe in life after death. We are the only people that believe in a resurrection. We're not the only people that believe in life after death. Many of the Greek gods in Greek mythology, they believed in existence of the spirit after death. They just didn't believe that spirit would ever be united with the body. So when Paul was with them, and certainly when he wrote this letter here to them about the second coming of Christ and the resurrection of the dead, some of them couldn't accept the resurrection of the dead. And so they had misconceptions about this, and some of them were teaching. If you remember when he wrote to the Corinthian church, remember he spent 1.5 years in Corinth now on his second journey. When he wrote to the Corinthian church in Corinthians chapter 15, he said, how say some that there's no resurrection of the dead? Why would he say that? Because there were people there in Corinth, because maybe of their Greco-Roman culture or whatever, they refused to believe in the resurrection of the dead. And Paul spent the whole chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, not only trying, but very plainly laying out that there is a resurrection of the dead, and if we as Christians don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, really we don't have any faith at all. You know, if we don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, then basically we're saying we don't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, and if we don't believe Jesus was raised from the dead, then we don't even believe anything. And so Paul, in writing this letter to the Thessalonians here, he starts this off, this discussion about the resurrection. He says in verse 13, chapter 4, "But I would not have you be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as those which have no hope." Now there's so much, I can't do it tonight, there's so much to be said about these 5 verses that we're going to be dealing with here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 here. The very first one here says, don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have no hope, that you grieve not as those who have no hope. What was Paul saying? He wasn't telling those Christians not to grieve. Apparently, those Christians there at Thessalonica had lost some loved ones who had died, and they were grieving. But Timothy had apparently told him that some of their grief was pretty distraught, without any hope. And Paul is writing to tell them, I don't want you guys to be ignorant. I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope. Do you suppose when we take the Richardson family, we know that that family is hurting beyond belief now. All of us that have experienced similar things know what they're going through to some extent. It's bad to lose a loved one under any conditions, but when you lose a loved one suddenly, unexpectedly, it's especially hard. But you and I can be sure tonight that the Richardson family is not grieving as someone who has no hope. And that's what Paul wrote to these Thessalonians. Keep in mind that in the culture that they lived in, I forgot this one little important thing. It'll help maybe to understand a few things. When you read about this establishment of the church there in Thessalonica and Paul going in and reasoning in the synagogues for 3 Sabbaths, it says, and some of the Jews believed, but many of the Greeks did, and the devout women, which means religious women, not a few. So we get the picture in this church in Thessalonica, the majority of that church was Gentiles. They weren't Jews anyway. And they had come out of a culture where they believed when you died, you would never see that loved one again. There would be no resurrection of the body. The body would stay in the ground. It would turn in decayed into dust, and that would be it as far as the body is concerned. So when Paul is telling these people not to grieve as those who have no hope, he's not saying don't grieve. It is natural for us to grieve, for mankind to grieve when we lose someone we love. You know, I think about the story of Lazarus, and we have the record that Jesus wept. Now, I know there's a lot of things that have been said to explain that. I really think, basically, Jesus wept not for Lazarus, because he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He wept because that family that he loved so much were in such anguish and grief, and it just got the best of him. And it happens to you and I. When we go sometimes to a funeral home or whatever, and sometimes we make it pretty good till we get up to the family. And sometimes because they are broken, it breaks us. And I think that's exactly what Jesus did. I don't think he was crying, or he wept rather, because Lazarus died. He knew he was going to raise Lazarus. But at the same time, he did weep. It's natural for people to weep when you lose loved ones. Paul is not condemning that. He's not forbidding that. He's saying don't weep as those who have no hope. In other words, we know that the resurrection is a truth. We know that the resurrection is going to come about, and the resurrection is of the body. I told you earlier that many in the Greco-Roman culture believed in life after death. So what? They didn't believe in the resurrection. We believe in life after death, and we believe in the resurrection. Now, the next subject, and I can't get to it tonight, it's 1:45, I'm going to have to stop. Usually we don't go this long on Wednesday night anyway. But what I want us to talk about after we talk about grieving is those that have no hope, which I've tried to do tonight, to get us to see that Paul is forbidding them to grieve as they have no hope, to give them assurance we do have hope. We are going to see our loved ones again. And what I want to say about that is our resurrection is a bodily resurrection. It's not the spirit. The spirit doesn't die, folks. We know that. The spirit lives on after death. Death is separation of the body from the spirit. James 2:26 says, for as death is separation of the soul from the body, so is faith without works. Something to that effect. But anyway, in James 2:26, he clarifies, makes it very plain that death is separation of the soul from the body. I pointed out in here the other week, I think, when Tim was teaching, if you went back in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis 35, chapter 35, when Rachel died, when she gave birth to Benjamin, it says, the scripture says, and as her soul was departing, in parentheses, for she died. You can't get any more clear evidence that death is a separation of the soul. It was departing from the body. Rachel's body remained there with her family when she died, and they buried her body. But her soul was in departing, for she died. So we know that. And in the resurrection, though, that soul that goes to be with Jesus, for those who are believers, who are saved, our spirit goes to be in Abraham's bosom, is the story that's given in Luke as it relates to the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Many people say that's a parable. It doesn't make any difference it's a parable or not. It's just as true. A parable is an earthly story with a spiritual, with a heavenly meaning. Would Jesus use an earthly story that was false to teach something that was true? That would be absurd for us to conclude that. So really it makes no difference if you believe the story of rich man and Lazarus was a parable or an actual event. I believe it was an actual event because Lazarus is named by name. There is no other parable. You can search the scriptures every way you want to. There is no other parable where anyone is given a name in the parable. So if the story of rich man and Lazarus is a parable, it's the only one where someone was given a name. But I believe it was a true event. Nevertheless, if it was a parable, it's still a true event. Jesus was teaching that after death we are conscious. Now I know there's confusion about the story of rich man and Lazarus. There's maybe confusion about this wide gulf and how they could hear across this wide gulf. There's one thing we have to conclude about the story of rich man and Lazarus. I don't care what your position is, whether it's a parable, whether it's an actual event. We have to conclude both parties were conscious after death. The righteous, meaning Lazarus, was conscious after death, and the rich man, the unrighteous, was conscious after death. So having said that, the spirit does not die. The spirit remains conscious. Now there are some who teach the soul sleeping. I wish I had time to get into that tonight. We will Sunday, but I don't have time to get into that tonight. But soul sleeping is completely foreign to what the Bible teaches, although there are some people that believe that, tragic as it might be. I've got to quit. It's 10 minutes till. Thank you for being here. I'm sure Jim will be back next week. I said that Sunday I would do that. I don't think we are meeting, my class will be meeting in the auditorium Sunday, but maybe Sunday week we will. That concludes it.
Shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah unto the Lord. Shout to the Lord. Sing aloud to God, that the people shall be for